They boiled his head, not as punishment, as preservation. Sir Thomas More, the king's most trusted advisor, lost everything for one word he refused to say. They took his freedom, his fortune, and his life on a blood-soaked scaffold. But even death wasn't the end. What happened to his severed head on London Bridge was darker than the execution itself. His daughter watched it rot for a month, then did something so desperate, so forbidden, that it could have cost her own life. If you want the full story they don't teach in history class, hit subscribe now. This is the execution of Thomas More, and it was far more horrifying than you think. London, 1529. Thomas More stood at the peak of power that most men only dream of. At 51 years old, he became Lord Chancellor of England, the highest office in the realm, second only to the king himself. Henry VIII trusted him more than any man alive. They had walked in the palace gardens together, discussing philosophy and theology until midnight. The king had once surprised More at his home in Chelsea, draping an arm around his shoulders like a brother. More was brilliant, witty, devoted, the perfect servant. But Henry VIII wanted something More could not give him. The king's obsession with Anne Boleyn had grown into a fever. Catherine of Aragon, his wife of 20 years, had given him only one surviving child, a daughter. Henry needed a son, he needed an heir, and he needed the Pope to annul his marriage so he could marry Anne. When Rome refused, Henry made a decision that would fracture England forever. He declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, severing ties with the Catholic Church, rewriting the laws of God to suit his desires. More watched in silence as the king tore apart everything he believed in. In May of 1532, he resigned as Lord Chancellor. He gave no public reason, claiming only illness and exhaustion. But everyone knew the truth. More could not, would not support Henry's break from Rome. The king's affection curdled into something darker. On June 1, 1533, Anne Boleyn was crowned Queen of England in Westminster Abbey. Every nobleman, every official, every person of importance was commanded to attend. More stayed home. It was a calculated insult, a public rejection of everything Henry had done. The king did not forgive insults. Then came the oath. In 1534, Parliament passed the Act of Succession, declaring Anne Boleyn's children legitimate heirs to the throne. But the oath required more than that. It required men to swear that Henry was supreme head of the church, that the Pope had no authority in England, that everything Henry had done was righteous and ordained by God. More refused to take the oath. He did not speak against it. He did not write pamphlets or preach rebellion. He simply stayed silent, believing that English law could not compel a man to swear against his conscience. Silence, he thought, would protect him. Silence would keep him safe. He was wrong. On April 13, 1534, Thomas More was arrested. 4 royal commissioners came to his home in Chelsea and escorted him to Lambeth Palace for interrogation. They demanded he take the oath. He refused. They demanded he explain why. He refused that, too. By the end of the day, More was no longer a free man. The Tower of London opened its gates, and Thomas More walked inside, knowing he might never walk out. The king's best friend had become his greatest enemy. And in Tudor England, the king's enemies did not die peacefully. The Tower of London was not just a prison, it was a place where hope went to die. More was led through the cold stone corridors to the bell tower, a circular chamber with walls thick enough to swallow screams. One narrow window, a wooden bed, a single candle. The door locked behind him with a sound that echoed through 15 centuries of suffering. He was alone. The lieutenant of the tower visited him repeatedly in those first weeks, speaking in soft, reasonable tones. The king bore him no ill will. The king simply wanted him to sign. One signature, one oath, and More could return to his family, his books, his garden in Chelsea. One word, and all of this would end. More gave them nothing. He had learned the law too well. In Tudor England, silence could not be used as evidence of treason. If he spoke against the king, they could execute him.
If he spoke in favor, he would damn his soul. So he stayed silent, a strategy that infuriated his interrogators more than any defiant speech could have. They needed him to speak, they needed him to confess. Without words, they had no case. Weeks turned into months. More's family was allowed to visit at first. His beloved daughter, Margaret Roper, came as often as the guards permitted, bringing food, letters, small comforts. She begged him to relent. His wife Alice arrived, practical and furious, unable to understand why he would throw away everything for a principle. She shouted at him in the tower chamber, her voice raw with desperation. "Just sign it. Just say the words. Come home." But More could not. To him, it was not politics. It was not pride. It was the difference between salvation and damnation, between truth and betrayal of everything he had ever believed. The king's patience wore thin. By November of 1534, More's conditions worsened. He was moved to close keeping, a harsher form of imprisonment. No more visitors, no more letters, no more firewood. In winter, his books and writing materials were confiscated. The single window in his cell let in the bitter cold but no sunlight. He wore his shirt hair beneath
his clothes, the coarse fabric scraping his skin raw, a secret penance no one could see. More grew weaker. His health, never robust, began to fail. The damp cold of the tower seeped into his bones. He could not stand for long without exhaustion, but still, he would not speak. The Crown tried a different approach. They interrogated Bishop John Fisher, another refuser, hoping to trap More through his friend's words. They brought in Thomas Cromwell, a king's ruthless secretary, who circled More like a wolf, probing for weakness. They sent priests, lawyers, former colleagues. Everyone who visited left frustrated. 15 months passed this way. 15 months of isolation, cold silence, and slow deterioration. More knew what was coming. Every prisoner in the tower knew. The only question was when worse it could get before the end. Inside the bell tower, Thomas More was becoming a ghost. His body, once strong enough to walk the estates of Chelsea for hours, had withered. The lack of proper food, the relentless cold, and the months of confinement had carved him hollow. His face, which had once been full and animated in conversation with the king, now hung gaunt and pale. His eyes, though still sharp with intelligence, were sunk deep into their sockets. He looked like a man already half dead. But beneath his outer robe, hidden from every guard and visitor, More wore something no one suspected, a hair shirt woven from coarse animal hair. It scratched and irritated his skin with every movement, every breath. He had worn it for years, long before his imprisonment, a private act of penance and devotion. Even now, strict of his titles, his freedom, and nearly his life, he kept this one secret discipline. It was his alone. The isolation gnawed at him in ways the cold never could. More was a man who lived through words. He had written books, letters, essays that circulated across Europe. He had debated with kings and scholars, his mind as sharp as any blade in England. But now, in close keeping, he had no pen, no paper, no voice. The silence he had chosen as legal strategy had become his entire existence. He could not write to his daughter. He could not read. He could not even pray aloud without the guards listening through the door. Time moved differently in the tower. Days blurred together in the dim light. There was no work to fill the hours, no conversation to mark their passing, just the sound of his own breathing and the distant echoes of footsteps in the corridor outside. Some prisoners went mad in these conditions. More had seen it happen. Men who entered the tower whole and left broken, babbling, unrecognizable. More fought it with the only weapon he had left, his mind. He prayed silently, reciting psalms and scripture from memory. He constructed arguments in his head, imagining the debates he could no longer have. He thought of Margaret, his brightest child, the daughter who understood him better than anyone. He wondered if she was safe, if the king's anger would extend to his family after he was gone. And he knew with absolute certainty that he was going to die. There was no escape from the tower for men accused of treason, no last-minute pardons for those who defied Henry VIII. More had watched others walk this same path. He had seen the carts carrying the condemned through the streets.
He had heard the crowds at Tower Hill, the roar that went up when the axe fell. He knew exactly what awaited him. The only question now was the manner of it, and whether, when the moment came, he would have the strength to face it without breaking. The waiting, he realized, was its own kind of torture, one the king had perfected. July 1st, 1535, Westminster Hall. Thomas More stood trial for treason, not because of what he had done, but because of what he refused to say. The charges were flimsy, built on silence and inference. The prosecution knew it. More knew it. Everyone in that crowded hall knew it. Under English law, silence could not convict a man. They needed evidence. They needed a confession. They needed Richard Rich. Rich was a man More had once employed, a lawyer of middling talent and flexible morals. He had worked in More's household years earlier, but More had never trusted him. There was something hollow behind Rich's eyes, an emptiness where principle should have been. Now that emptiness would prove useful to the crown. Rich took the stand and lied. He testified that during a private conversation in the Tower, More had explicitly denied the king's supremacy over the church. He claimed More had said the Parliament had no authority to make Henry the head of the church, that it was an offense against God. It was exactly the confession the crown needed, and it was entirely fabricated. More rose to defend himself, his voice steady despite his weakened body. He dismantled Rich's testimony piece by piece. Why would he, who had refused to speak to the king's own commissioners, to Archbishop Canmer, to Thomas Cromwell himself, suddenly confide in Richard Rich, a man of no importance? Why would he break 15 months of strategic silence for someone he barely trusted? The courtroom listened, but it didn't matter. More turned to Rich directly, his words cutting through the hall like a blade. "If this oath you have taken be true, then I pray I may never see God in the face, which I would not say were it otherwise for anything on earth." He paused, letting the weight settle. Then he asked the question everyone was thinking. "Can it therefore seem likely
To your honorable lordships that I would, in so weighty a cause, so unadvisedly overshoot myself as to trust Master Rich, a man I had always reputed for a person of little truth?" Rich did not flinch. He had already been promised his reward. Within weeks of the trial, he would be appointed Attorney General of Wales. The price of his soul had been negotiated and paid. The jury deliberated for 15 minutes. Guilty. The Lord Chancellor stood to pronounce sentence, but before he could speak, More finally broke his silence, not to confess, not to beg, but to condemn. He declared the act of supremacy was directly opposed to the laws of God and the Church. He had held his tongue for over a year, and now, with nothing left to lose, he spoke the truth they had tortured him to hear. It made no difference. The sentence had already been written, and what they read aloud next was worse than More had ever imagined, worse than the axe, worse than death itself. The sentence they read out in Westminster Hall was never meant to be carried out. It was meant to terrify. Thomas More was condemned not simply to die, but to be hanged, drawn, and quartered in Tudor England. That was the ultimate sentence for treason. First, he would be stripped of his status and dragged on a hurdle through the filthy streets from the Tower to Tyburn, tied down like an animal for the crowd to jeer at. Then he would be hanged by the neck, but only until he was half dead. Cut down before death, he was to be mutilated, his body opened, his inner organs taken out and burned before his eyes. His body would be chopped into quarters, his head severed and put on display as a public warning. The words were formula, but everyone in that hall knew what they meant in practice. They had seen it done before. The slow spectacle, the public cruelty, the way the crown used the human body as a message. For a man already weakened by months in the Tower, it was a sentence designed to break not just flesh, but courage. More did something unexpected. When they finished pronouncing the horrors laid out for him, he bowed his head slightly and answered with a strange calm. He reminded them that St. Paul had once stood before Nero, that he was ready to suffer for his conscience, as Christians had always done. There was no pleading, no attempt to bargain for mercy. He accepted that the earthly court had spoken, but he made it clear he did not accept its justice.
Outside the hall, however, another calculation was already taking place. Henry VIII had once loved Thomas More. He had walked with him, trusted him, leaned on his advice when England's future seemed uncertain. To subject this former friend to the full ritual of hanging, drawing, and quartering risked two things the king could not afford: public sympathy and a martyr, his legend too grotesque to control. Executing him was necessary. Turning him into a slowly tortured spectacle was dangerous. So, after the trial, the sentence was quietly altered. The king commuted the punishment to simple beheading on Tower Hill. On paper, it was an act of royal mercy, a sign that Henry still remembered the bond they had once shared. In reality, it was a cold political choice. A single stroke of the axe would end More's life quickly, without the days of public horror that might have turned the people's stomachs against the crown. More heard of the change in his cell. The man who had just been promised the most brutal death England could inflict was now told he would die by the axe instead. It did not save him, it did not spare his body from what would follow, but it shaped what his final mourning would look like and how the world would watch him die. Mercy in the hands of a tyrant is still cruelty. It just wears a gentler mask. Henry VIII's decision to spare More the full horror of being hanged, drawn, and quartered was calculated theater. It allowed the king to appear magnanimous while still achieving his goal: the public death of a man who had defied him. The commutation was announced as a royal favor, a gesture of respect for More's years of loyal service, but no one was fooled. This was not forgiveness, this was control. Beheading, though quicker, carried its own deep humiliations. In Tudor England, execution by the axe was reserved for nobility and high-ranking officials. It was considered an honorable death compared to the drawn-out torture of commoners. But that honor was hollow. The condemned still died in front of a crowd, their final moments were still a public spectacle, their bodies still left to the mercy of the state. And what happened after the axe fell was often worse than the execution itself. More understood this better than most. He had been a judge, a lawyer, a man who had watched the machinery of royal justice grind through lives for decades. He knew that the manner of his death would be crafted to send a message. The king wanted him gone, but not in a way that would ignite rebellion or sympathy among the people. The execution had to look just, efficient, and final. Yet beneath the veneer of this so-called mercy was something darker, a king who could not admit he was wrong. Henry had loved Thomas More. That affection had been real once, before Anne Boleyn, before the break with Rome, before the relentless machinery of ambition turned Henry into something unrecognizable. More had been his intellectual equal, his moral compass, the only man whose approval had mattered. Now that man sat in a tower cell, waiting to die, and Henry could not bring himself to let him suffer the absolute worst, not because of compassion, but because of the ghost of who they had once been to each other. But the king's restraint had limits. More would die on Tower Hill, not at Tyburn. That alone was telling. Tyburn executions were grand, bloody public festivals where thousands gathered to watch traitors meet their end in agony. Tower Hill was closer, quieter, more controlled. The king wanted More dead, but he did not want the spectacle to spiral beyond his grasp. He wanted the execution to happen quickly, witnessed by enough people to prove it was done, but not so many that it became a moment of dangerous public emotion.
Date was set, July 6, 1535. 5 days after the guilty verdict. 5 days for More to prepare his soul, to say what farewells the guards would allow, and to ready himself for the walk to the scaffold. The king had given him the axe instead of the rope, but the axe still fell, and what came after, what they did to his body, his head, his memory, was where the real horror began. Dawn broke over the Tower of London on July 6, 1535, cold and gray. Thomas More had not slept. He had spent the night in prayer, kneeling on the stone floor of his cell, whispering the words of songs he had memorized as a young man. His knees ached. His body, worn down by 15 months of imprisonment, trembled with exhaustion. But his mind was clear. He knew this was his last sunrise. At 9 in the morning, a door to his cell opened. Sir Thomas Pope entered, a man More had known for years. Pope's face was pale, his voice unsteady as he delivered the message from the king. More was to die before noon. He was to be taken to the scaffold on Tower Hill, and the king, in his final act of control, had given one last order. Keep your words brief. No long speeches, no public sermons. Henry did not want More's voice ringing out across the crowd, stirring doubt or sympathy. He wanted this done quietly. More received the news without flinching. He thanked Pope for his kindness and asked for a moment to dress. He chose a plain gray woolen robe, simple and unremarkable. No fine fabrics, no symbols of his former status. Beneath it, hidden as always, was the hair shirt he had worn against his skin for years. He picked up a small red wooden cross, holding it loosely in his hands. It was the only possession he would carry to his death. The walk from the bell tower to Tower Hill was short, only 200 yards, but every step was agony. More's legs, weakened for months without proper food or exercise, barely supported him. He leaned heavily on a wooden staff, moving slowly through the fortress grounds. Guards flanked him on both sides, not out of fear he would run, but because he might collapse before reaching the scaffold. The summer air, warm and thick, felt foreign after so long in the cold damp of his cell. He could hear the crowd before he saw them. Hundreds of people had gathered at Tower Hill, maybe more. Executions were public events, and word had spread quickly that the former Lord Chancellor would die today. Some came out of curiosity, others out of respect. A few whispered prayers as More passed, crossing themselves when the guards were not looking. The king had ordered discretion, but the people had come anyway. And then More saw it, the scaffold, a raised wooden platform, stark and bare, standing against the pale sky. The block rested in the center, a thick piece of timber worn smooth by use. Beside it stood the executioner, dressed in red, his face obscured by a hood. In his hands he held the axe. The blade caught the morning light, sharp and clean. It had been used before. It would be used again. But in this moment, it was meant for only one man. The crowd pressed closer as More approached the scaffold steps. Faces blurred together, merchants, laborers, women clutching children, men who had once worked under More's authority when he was Lord Chancellor. They had come to witness the fall of a man who had stood at the right hand of the king. Some watched with pity, others with cold indifference. A few openly wept, but all of them were silent now, waiting. Among them, hidden in the mass of bodies, were two women who should not have been there. Margaret Roper and Margaret Clement. More's daughters had defied the king's explicit order. Henry had forbidden More's family from attending the execution, fearing their presence might stir emotion or sympathy among the crowd. But the two women had slipped past the guards, cloaked and unrecognized, determined to witness their father's final moments. They stood near the back, close enough to see, but far enough to avoid detection. Margaret Roper's hands trembled as she gripped her sister's arm. She had begged him to recant, to save himself, to come home. He had refused. Now she could only watch. More reached the base of the scaffold and paused. The structure was old, poorly maintained. The wooden steps creaked under the weight of the guards. More looked up at them, then at the executioner waiting above. He turned to the lieutenant escorting him and spoke quietly, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearest. "I pray you see me safe up for my coming down. Let me shift for myself." It was a joke, a moment of levity in the shadow of death. A few in the crowd smiled despite themselves. Even now, with minutes left to live, Thomas More refused to let fear strip him of his wit. He climbed the scaffold slowly, gripping the railing for support. Each step felt heavier than the last. When he reached the top, he steadied himself and turned to face the crowd. Hundreds of eyes stared back at him. He could feel the weight of their expectations, their questions, their judgment.
The king had ordered him to keep his words brief. He would obey, but he would not be silent. More raised his voice, clear and firm, despite his weakened body. He told them he died the king's good servant, but God's first. 7 words, simple, direct, impossible to misinterpret. He was not a traitor to England, he was loyal to a higher authority. The crowd absorbed the statement in silence, some nodding, others shifting uncomfortably. The guards did not interrupt. The words were brief, as commanded. There was nothing treasonous in them, at least.
Nothing the king could prosecute after the man was already dead. More turned away from the crowd and toward the executioner. The moment of public witness was over. What came next belonged to him alone. The executioner stood motionless, axe in hand, waiting. His face was hidden beneath a red hood, as tradition demanded. No one was supposed to know his identity, but his body language betrayed him. Shoulders tight, hands gripping the wooden handle too firmly. He had done this before. He knew how to kill. But this was different. Thomas More was not a common criminal or a nameless traitor. He was a man the entire kingdom had once revered, and now the executioner had to end his life in front of hundreds of witnesses. More approached him slowly, each step deliberate. The executioner dropped to his knees, a gesture required by custom. He asked for More's forgiveness, as all executioners did before carrying out a sentence. It was theater, a ritual meant to absolve him of guilt. The condemned man was supposed to grant forgiveness, to release the executioner from the sin of murder. Without it, the weight of the death would rest on the executioner's soul forever. More looked down at the hooded man kneeling before him. For a moment, he said nothing. The crowd held its breath. Then More spoke, his voice gentle, almost kind. "Pluck up thy spirits, man, and be not afraid to do thine office. My neck is very short. Take heed, therefore, thou strike not awry, for saving of thine honesty." Another joke. Even here, with the axe gleaming in the executioner's hands, More could not resist. But beneath the humor was something else, a reassurance. He was not angry. He did not blame the man for what he was about to do. The executioner was simply a tool in the king's hand. More understood that, and he wanted the man to know he held no malice. The executioner arose, visibly shaken, and stepped back. More knelt down carefully on the scaffold, his knees finding the warm wood where so many others had knelt before him. He adjusted his position, making sure his body was stable. The block was low, barely a foot off the ground, forcing him to lean forward awkwardly. His neck, thin and exposed, rested against the rough timber. He could feel the grain of the wood against his skin, the splinters, the faint dampness from morning dew. He closed his eyes and began to pray. His lips moved silently, reciting Psalm 51. "Have mercy upon me, O God, according to thy loving kindness, according unto the multitude of thy tender mercies. Blot out my transgressions." The words were private, meant only for God. The crowd could not hear them, but they saw his composure, the steadiness of his breath, the absence of panic. More finished his prayer and opened his eyes one last time. He reached forward with both hands, stretching his arms out along the scaffold floor. It was the signal. He was ready. The executioner lifted the axe high above his head, the blade catching the midnight sun. The crowd fell silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. And then, in one swift motion, it was over. The axe came down in a single stroke. It was clean, precise. The executioner had done his job well. More's body slumped forward onto the scaffold, lifeless. The crowd released a collective breath, some gasping, others covering their mouths. A few turned away, but most kept watching, unable to look away from what came next. The executioner bent down and lifted More's severed head by the hair. He raised it high above his head, turning slowly so the entire crowd could see.
His voice rang out across Tower Hill, loud and calm, the same words spoken at every execution for treason. "Behold the head of a traitor." The declaration hung in the air like a challenge, but the crowd did not cheer. There were no shouts of approval, no jeers or mockery, just silence. A heavy, uncomfortable silence that stretched longer than it should have. These people had seen executions before. They knew how to respond, but this time something felt wrong. This was not a traitor. This was Thomas More, and everyone standing there knew the difference. The executioner lowered the head, his duty complete. More's body was carried off the scaffold by Tower officials, wrapped in rough cloth and taken to the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, inside the Tower walls. There, in an unmarked grave beneath the stone floor, his body was buried with little ceremony. No elaborate funeral, no monument, just a shallow grave among dozens of others who had met the same fate. The king wanted him forgotten, but his head would not be buried. By law, the heads of executed traitors belonged to the crown. They were not meant to rest in peace. They were meant to serve as warnings, displayed in the most public places in London, so that anyone passing by would see what happened to those who defied the king. More's head was taken from the scaffold, still dripping, and handed over to the authorities responsible for preparing it for display. And that preparation was more grotesque than most people realized. The head could not simply be placed on a spike and left to rot. It would decay too quickly, attracting flies and scavengers, becoming unrecognizable within days. The crown needed it to last longer, weeks ideally, long enough for the message to sink in. So, they employed a method that had been used for centuries, one that preserved flesh without embalming, a process that was as much about humiliation as it was practicality. More's head was placed in a large iron pot filled with water and oak bark extract. The mixture was brought to a near boil, the heat seeping into the severed flesh, tanning it like leather.
The process stained his once white beard a dark mottled brown. His skin shriveled and hardened. His features, though still recognizable, took on a leathery, distorted quality. When the process was finished, the head was dried and impaled on a pike, and then it was carried to London Bridge, where it would stay for nearly a month, exposed to the sun, the rain, and the eyes of everyone who crossed the Thames. London Bridge was the busiest crossing in England. Thousands of people passed over it every day, merchants hauling goods, travelers entering the city, families going to market. It was impossible to cross the Thames without using it, and it was impossible to cross the bridge without seeing them. The heads, rows of them, impaled on iron pikes above the stone gateway at the southern end, their hollow eyes staring down at everyone below. Thomas More's head joined them in mid-July 1535. It was placed on a pike near the center of the display, high enough that it could be seen from both sides of the river. The tanning process had preserved it, but it had also transformed it. His once dignified face was now darkened and leathery, his white beard stained brown from the boiling oak bark. His mouth hung slightly open. His eyes were gone, taken by birds or decay. What remained was a grotesque echo of the man who had once been Lord Chancellor. The other heads around him were in worse condition. Some had been there for months, reduced to skulls with bits of dried flesh clinging to bone. Others were fresher, still recognizable, their features twisted in the final moments before death. The display was meant to inspire fear, to remind every person entering London that the king's justice was absolute. Cross him, and this is where you end up. Forgotten, rotting, a warning to strangers. But More's head did not fade into the background like the others. People stopped when they saw it.